What if the thing that finally hands the U.S. military real, usable leverage over Iran wasn't a missile strike, a naval maneuver, or a diplomatic breakthrough, but a single sentence spoken out loud by the wrong person at exactly the wrong time? Before we get into what actually happened, hit subscribe right now so you catch the next update on this story the moment it breaks. Tap like right now if you think geopolitics deserves clear, patient explanations instead of noise and panic. And send this along right now to someone who still thinks this standoff is just about ships and oil prices, because the real story underneath all of it is about who actually controls a country's own military. Let's start with the water itself, because nothing about this story makes sense without it. The Strait of Hormuz is barely 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, a thin ribbon of ocean that somehow carries close to a fifth of the entire world's oil supply through it every single day it's open. When something happens here, the effects don't stay local. They ripple out through fuel prices, shipping costs, and eventually the price of nearly everything that has to travel by sea to reach you. Picture just how concentrated that risk actually is. A fifth of the entire planet's oil supply funneling through a passage narrow enough that you could see the opposite shore on a clear day. There's no equivalent alternate route that ships can simply reroute through if this one becomes unreliable, not without adding weeks and enormous cost to every single voyage. That's precisely why. A handful of missiles, a handful of boats, and a handful of public statements from officials most people outside the region have never heard of can move global oil prices within hours. For months, this exact stretch of water has sat at the center of the standoff between the United States and Iran. On July 14th, American forces reimposed a naval blockade against Iranian ports, a direct response to Iran targeting commercial vessels transiting the strait just days earlier. That blockade effectively ended a brief period of calm that had followed a memorandum of understanding signed back in mid-June, an agreement that for a few short weeks had actually let tension ease and shipping traffic partially resume. Once the blockade snapped back into place, the numbers told their own blunt story. Within the first 2 days of the renewed operation, American forces had directed 51 commercial vessels to turn around or return to port rather than risk the crossing. Over the following weeks, that enforcement continued steadily, with additional ships redirected, several disabled after failing to comply, and a handful boarded to confirm what they were actually carrying. Not one vessel attempting to defy the blockade got through clean. To put that traffic collapse in perspective, on the day before this war originally began back in February, roughly 147 ships crossed the strait in a single day. By early July, before the most recent blockade even went back into effect, that number had fallen to just 22 crossings in a day. This isn't a minor slowdown. It's a waterway that used to carry a genuine river of global commerce, reduced to a fraction of its normal traffic, with the world's oil markets watching every single shift nervously. This isn't purely the work of naval enforcement either. Iran has been an active participant in keeping that traffic suppressed, and not through statements alone. Just this past weekend, the United Arab Emirates reported that a vessel belonging to its state oil company was targeted by a missile while crossing the strait. It wasn't an isolated incident. The UAE's foreign ministry didn't hedge its language describing it either calling the use of the strait as a tool of economic coercion, an act of piracy, and describing it as a direct threat to regional stability and global energy security. That's not diplomatic language chosen lightly. It's the kind of accusation a government makes when it has stopped expecting things to improve through quiet channels alone. And yet, even with ships being turned back and tankers getting struck, oil prices haven't spiked the way you might expect from a crisis this serious. That tells its own story. Markets aren't panicking, but they aren't expecting a quick resolution either. What traders are watching instead looks like a long, grinding standoff, the kind that doesn't resolve in a single dramatic headline, but instead grinds on week after week, testing everyone's patience simultaneously. Traders have learned over months of this conflict that reacting sharply to every individual headline out of this region tends to be a losing strategy, since so many of those headlines get partially walked back or reframed within days. Behind all of that public tension, a very different conversation had been unfolding quietly. For roughly a week leading up to this moment, Iranian officials had been working closely with Oman, describing the discussions in genuinely confident terms. Coordinates for new shipping routes had reportedly been agreed upon. A joint framework was described as being in its final stages, needing only approval from the highest levels of Iran's leadership before becoming official. On paper, that sounded like exactly the kind of breakthrough this crisis has needed for months. If you're starting to see how this story splits into two completely different tracks running at once, that's exactly the shape of what's coming next in this breakdown. So drop a comment with which side of this you think is actually telling the truth right now, because I genuinely want to know where this audience lands. But there was a problem, and it didn't come from outside Iran's government. It came from within it. While Iran's diplomats were quietly building momentum toward an agreement, a different voice inside that same government was building an entirely separate case, one that spoke not for negotiating tables, but for the people who physically control the strait itself. That voice belongs to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. And this past weekend, its spokesperson said something that stopped a lot of people paying close attention in their tracks. Speaking to reporters, the IRGC's spokesperson, General Hossein Mohebi, stated plainly that reopening the Strait of Hormuz operates under its own specific legal and defensive mechanisms, completely independent of whatever negotiations were happening between Iran and Oman. He went further, describing the strait not merely as an economic route, but as an expression of Iran's broader geopolitical influence and strategic power, something exercised according to Iran's own defense and sovereignty policies rather than any external agreement. Reopening it, he said, remained conditional on the United States, fully accepting Iran's own set of conditions, and ending what he described as interference in regional negotiations. Read that carefully, because it matters enormously. The exact organization that physically controls the waterway just said in public, on the record, that whatever deal its own government's diplomats might sign in Oman doesn't actually bind it. That's not a tough negotiating stance. It's a direct signal that the agreement so many observers have been hoping for might not actually govern what happens on the water at all. Think about how unusual that kind of public statement actually is in normal diplomatic practice. Governments occasionally have internal disagreements over strategy, but they typically keep those disagreements behind closed doors, presenting a unified face to the outside world, even when real friction exists underneath. What makes this moment different is that the disagreement wasn't leaked, wasn't inferred from contradictory actions, wasn't pieced together by analysts reading between the lines. It was stated directly by a named spokesperson on the record through an established state news agency. That's not a slip of the tongue, it's a deliberate choice to make an internal division visible to the entire world, which raises its own question about what the Revolutionary Guard actually gains by saying this out loud, rather than simply continuing to act independently while its diplomats kept talking. And Iran's demands, laid out separately by Mohammad Bagher Zolgadar, Secretary of Iran's Supreme National Security Council, weren't modest either. He listed a full set of conditions required before the strait would genuinely reopen: an end to American threats against Iran, a complete stop to military action against Iran and its regional allies, withdrawal of the naval and air forces currently enforcing the blockade, compensation for damage caused throughout this conflict, and the lifting of sanctions along with the unfreezing of Iranian assets. He stated flatly that the strait would never fully reopen until the United States, in his words, corrected its behavior. That's not the language of a government quietly finalizing paperwork. It's the language of a government setting a bar deliberately high enough that meeting it anytime soon looks genuinely unlikely. Look closely at that list of conditions, because the sequencing matters just as much as the content. Every single item on it requires the United States to act first, before Iran offers anything concrete in return. Stop the threats first, withdraw the forces first, pay compensation first, lift sanctions first. Only after all of that has already happened does the strait supposedly reopen. That's a fundamentally different negotiating posture than a mutual, phased agreement where both sides make simultaneous, verifiable concessions. It's closer to a list of preconditions than an actual opening offer. And preconditions framed that way tend to function less as a genuine roadmap toward resolution and more as a way of ensuring the other side gets blamed for the standoff continuing. Oman, caught in the middle of this as the primary mediator, issued its own careful statement describing the negotiations as continuing in what it called a positive and constructive atmosphere, while explicitly condemning the repeated attacks on ships transiting the strait. Oman's language didn't name Iran directly, but the message was clear enough. Actions that undermine these talks put the entire process at risk, no matter which side ultimately takes responsibility for them. This is where the contradiction becomes impossible to ignore. Iran's foreign ministry has spent roughly a week telling the world a deal was close, that coordinates had been agreed, that a joint statement was nearly finalized. Every one of those statements came from the same government, pointing in the same reassuring direction. Then, within roughly 24 hours, a completely different voice from within the same government said something that upended the entire picture. And this isn't the first time something like this has happened either. Earlier in this conflict, a previous ceasefire was agreed to, only for the Revolutionary Guard to act independently and continue striking ships anyway. The pattern is becoming difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Diplomats speak the language of peace. The military acts according to its own separate calculus. And each time this happens, the same uncomfortable question resurfaces. Who is actually making the decisions that matter here? There's a detail buried in recent military assessments that adds real weight to this question, too. America's top uniformed officer, General Dan Kane, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, publicly noted that since the ceasefire framework was first announced, Iran had fired at commercial vessels 9 separate times, seized 2 container ships, and attacked American forces more than 10 times, all of it occurring below what he described as the threshold that would restart full-scale combat operations. Read that assessment carefully, because it reveals something significant about how Washington is currently interpreting Iran's behavior. Not as isolated violations that each demand an immediate military response, but as a sustained pattern of pressure that Iran's military wing appears comfortable applying regardless of what its own diplomats are simultaneously promising. That specific framing, actions occurring below the threshold that would restart major combat, deserves a moment of its own attention. It suggests American planners have essentially built a working model of exactly how much pressure Iran's military can apply before it forces a full-scale response, and that Iran's Revolutionary Guard has been operating right up against that line repeatedly for months without quite crossing it. That's not accidental restraint. It looks a lot more like a deliberate strategy, testing exactly how much can be gotten away with while a parallel diplomatic track keeps offering the appearance of progress. If that's an accurate read of the situation, then the IRGC's public statement this weekend wasn't really a departure from that strategy at all. It was simply the moment that strategy stopped being implicit and became explicit. That's really the significance behind the title of this video. For months, American military planners have needed exactly this kind of clarity, a moment where Iran's own military openly, publicly, on the record, admits it doesn't consider itself bound by whatever its diplomats agree to elsewhere. That admission doesn't help Iran's negotiating position. It genuinely helps Washington's, because it removes any remaining ambiguity about who actually needs to be dealt with to guarantee safe passage through the strait. A signed piece of paper from Oman was never going to stop. A missile. Only the organization actually firing that missile can do that, and that organization has now said, clearly and publicly, exactly what it will and won't accept. Think about what that clarity actually solves from a purely practical operational standpoint. Before this statement, American negotiators faced a genuinely difficult problem: uncertainty about whether an agreement reached with Iran's foreign ministry would actually be honored by the forces physically operating in the strait. That uncertainty made any agreement inherently risky to rely on. Now that risk has effectively been named out loud by the party responsible for it, Washington no longer has to guess whether a diplomatic solution alone would be sufficient. It's been told plainly that it wouldn't be, at least not without separately satisfying an entirely different set of conditions from an entirely different institution inside the same government. We're good way into this story already, and there's a lot more worth understanding about how this rift actually plays out day to day, both on the water and in the air above it, hour after hour. If you're finding this useful, hit subscribe now, because the operational side of this standoff, how the United States is actually maintaining pressure hour by hour, is honestly the part most coverage skips over entirely. While Iran's government argues with itself over who genuinely controls the strait, a separate operation has been running quietly, almost invisibly, above the water the entire time. It doesn't hold press conferences. It doesn't issue contradicting public statements. It simply stays airborne day and night without meaningful pause. At the center of that operation sits an aircraft most people outside military circles have probably never heard of: the KC-135 Stratotanker, a refueling aircraft that first flew back in 1956, decades before most of today's fighter pilots were even born. It was originally built for a Cold War mission that thankfully never actually happened, keeping nuclear bombers fueled long enough to reach the Soviet Union and return safely. That war never came. 7 decades later, the same basic airframe has found an entirely different purpose, becoming the quiet backbone of the naval blockade currently unfolding over the Persian Gulf. There's something almost poetic about a nearly 70-year-old aircraft design becoming the linchpin of a modern standoff most of its original designers could never have imagined. It's a reminder that sustained military pressure, the kind measured in months rather than single dramatic strikes, often depends less on the newest, flashiest hardware and more on unglamorous logistics working correctly, day after day, without interruption or fanfare. Without that kind of aerial refueling support, American fighter aircraft could typically only remain on station over the strait for around 90 minutes before needing to return to base. With it, those same aircraft can stay overhead essentially around the clock. That distinction matters more than it might initially sound like. In a standoff like this one, continuous presence isn't just a formality or show of force, it's the entire strategy. Every gap in coverage becomes an opportunity, a window where smugglers, armed vessels, or attack drones could potentially slip through unnoticed. The refueling bridge these aging tankers provide closes those gaps before they ever have a chance to open. Above the water itself, different aircraft operate in coordinated layers, each carrying its own specific role. Fighters equipped with advanced radar and sensor systems maintain a full surrounding view of everything nearby, functioning almost like flying. Surveillance platforms rather than traditional combat aircraft, capable of spotting a small boat leaving an Iranian port from considerable distance and instantly sharing that information across every other aircraft and vessel operating in the area. Other fighter squadrons carry precision-guided systems specifically capable of tracking fast-moving drones, letting pilots stay focused on safely navigating contested airspace rather than manually guiding every individual engagement. That capability matters specifically because of how Iran has typically operated in these waters throughout this conflict. Rather than sending a single boat or drone at a time, Iranian forces have frequently sent groups of them simultaneously, hoping sheer numbers might overwhelm whatever response is waiting. A fighter capable of engaging multiple targets in rapid succession changes that math considerably, and does so at a fraction of the cost of whatever it's shooting down. That cost imbalance deserves its own moment of attention because it's part of what makes this kind of sustained defensive operation actually sustainable, over months rather than weeks. A drone or small armed boat represents a relatively modest investment for whoever is deploying it. The systems built to detect, track, and neutralize that same threat represent a vastly larger investment on the defending side. Any strategy built around simply absorbing wave after wave of cheap, expendable threats using expensive precision systems eventually runs into its own kind of arithmetic problem, which is part of why the layered surveillance and interception approach, spotting and engaging efficiently, rather than relying purely on brute force, matters as much as it does to keeping this entire operation financially sustainable. Behind every one of those fighters, the aging tanker fleet remains the quiet foundation making the entire operation possible. Every minute a fighter spends actively patrolling depends on a tanker being nearby and ready. It's not glamorous work. It almost never makes headlines. But without it, the entire structure holding this blockade together would likely collapse within hours, rather than sustaining itself for months the way it actually has. There's also a newer piece of the system that hasn't been formally confirmed in actual combat yet, but is worth watching closely regardless. A vertical takeoff autonomous aircraft currently in development is designed specifically to operate without needing a traditional runway or a fixed base that could itself become a target, running largely on its own onboard mission software with minimal outside guidance required. According to figures from the company developing it, somewhere between 10 and 20 of these aircraft could reportedly be built for roughly the cost of a single next-generation stealth bomber. If systems like this eventually get deployed alongside existing fighters and the ongoing naval blockade, they could genuinely reshape how standoffs like this one get managed in the future. For now, though, the system already in place, built around a decades-old refueling aircraft and a rotation of advanced fighters, remains the primary reason American forces have sustained pressure over the strait for this long without a single aircraft coming under direct attack from Iranian forces. For months, plenty of analysts described this entire situation as fundamentally a diplomatic problem, something that could eventually be resolved through careful talks and patient agreement. But the events of just the past several days point toward a different, more complicated reality. This waterway isn't actually being controlled from a negotiating table in Oman. It's being controlled on the water itself by the Revolutionary Guard through direct force. That's no longer a matter of interpretation or analyst speculation. The Guard said so itself, publicly and directly. Even if a formal deal eventually gets signed, the organization that physically operates in these waters has made unmistakably clear that it still considers itself the ultimate authority over the strait and intends to keep enforcing its own separate conditions, regardless of whatever Iran's diplomats agree to elsewhere. That raises a genuinely difficult question for anyone hoping this resolves cleanly. If Iran's own leadership doesn't fully control the forces actually operating in the strait, then any agreement signed in Oman may carry considerably less practical weight than its authors intend. Diplomatic language, however carefully worded, cannot physically stop a missile from launching. Only the specific group with its finger on that particular trigger can do that, and that group has now stated clearly, on the record, that it doesn't consider itself bound by outside agreements. It wasn't the one negotiating. If you've made it this far, you clearly want the complete picture rather than just a dramatic headline. So let's talk about where this genuinely fits into the wider pattern playing out well beyond this one waterway. Because the connections here are more revealing than they first appear. This particular divide inside Iran's government doesn't exist in total isolation either. It fits into a broader pattern currently playing out across multiple regions simultaneously, each testing how far sustained military pressure can go before it forces some kind of real, unavoidable response. In Ukraine, a similar strategy built around steady, targeted pressure has been unfolding, just aimed at a different category of target entirely. Rather than striking weapons directly, a sustained campaign has focused specifically on the supply chains that make continued weapons production possible. hitting logistics and distribution facilities repeatedly over recent weeks. Independent reporting suggests a meaningful share of one major company's largest logistics centers have gone out of operation as a direct result, forcing military units on the other end of that supply chain to start rationing basic components that are difficult to manufacture quickly under pressure. The underlying logic connecting that Ukraine campaign to what's happening in the Persian Gulf is worth naming directly. In both cases, the attacking side made a calculated decision that going after the infrastructure enabling a capability produces more lasting results than going after the capability itself in isolated bursts. Destroy a single drone, and another one gets built to replace it relatively quickly. Damage the supply chain producing the components for hundreds of drones, and the effects compound over months rather than resetting after each individual strike. That's essentially the same logic underneath a sustained naval blockade instead of a single dramatic strike on Iran's coastline. Slower, less visually dramatic, but considerably harder to simply absorb and move past. At almost the same time, thousands of kilometers away, Taiwan has been sending its own unmistakable signal. Newly deployed battle tanks were moved directly onto the tarmac of a major international airport, positioned alongside armored vehicles taking up defensive posture near commercial aircraft, with engineers seen actively assembling obstacles between runways. It marked the first time these particular tanks had ever been deployed in an airport setting like that. The reasoning becomes considerably clearer once you consider a similar scenario from a few years earlier, when a foreign power attempted to seize an airport outside a capital city early in a separate conflict specifically to use it as a supply route. Taiwan's current preparations look very much like a deliberate rehearsal of exactly those critical early hours, rather than any later stage of a hypothetical crisis. Taken together, these developments in the Persian Gulf, in Ukraine, and around Taiwan all reflect a genuinely common theme running underneath each of them. In every single case, military pressure is being applied steadily and deliberately, while public political statements consistently struggle to keep pace with what's actually happening on the ground in real time. Words move slowly and carefully. Pressure, once applied, tends to keep building regardless of whatever gets said about it publicly. Bringing this back specifically to the Strait of Hormuz, the coming weeks are genuinely likely to reveal whether Iran's government can actually bring its own military under one clearly unified position, or whether the visible gap between its diplomats and its Revolutionary Guard continues widening instead. Until that specific question gets answered, one way or another, the ships, the tankers, and the aircraft maintaining constant pressure above the water will remain the single clearest indicator of where this standoff genuinely stands, regardless of whatever gets said in any future statement out of Tehran. There's a deeper point worth sitting with here too, one that goes beyond just this specific waterway. Governments built around competing centers of power rarely resolve that tension quickly or cleanly. A diplomatic corps that wants to end a costly standoff, and a military wing that draws its own legitimacy and leverage from continuing to project strength don't automatically want the same outcome, even when they're technically part of the exact same government. Sometimes that tension resolves itself over months through internal political consolidation. Sometimes it simply persists indefinitely, with each side pursuing its own version of victory while foreign observers try to figure out which voice actually speaks for the country at any given moment. Iran's current situation looks a lot closer to the second scenario than the first, at least based on everything that's played out publicly over just the past several days alone. History offers plenty of examples of exactly this kind of internal split shaping how a conflict actually unfolds, regardless of what any single government's official position claims to be. A Revolutionary Guard, a party militia, or an independently funded security apparatus that answers to its own internal command structure rather than fully to civilian leadership tends to complicate every negotiation it touches, because outside governments can never be entirely certain which voice they're actually bargaining with on any given day. That structural uncertainty isn't unique to Iran, but it's rarely been demonstrated this openly, this publicly, in the middle of an active, ongoing standoff with this much riding on the outcome. That's ultimately why this moment matters so much more than a typical diplomatic update usually would. It's not simply that talks are close or that tensions remain high. It's that the organization actually holding the leverage on the water just told the entire world, unprompted and in plain language, that it doesn't consider itself bound by whatever gets negotiated elsewhere. For American military planners who have spent months trying to figure out exactly who they're actually negotiating with, that kind of clarity, however unwelcome it might be for the diplomatic track, is genuinely useful information. It tells you where the real decision-making authority sits, and it tells you that a signed agreement alone, however carefully worded, isn't going to be the thing that actually determines what happens the next time a tanker tries to cross that narrow stretch of water. So watch this space closely over the coming days. Watch whether Iran's foreign ministry and its Revolutionary Guard start speaking with anything resembling one unified voice, or whether this public contradiction keeps repeating itself the way it has multiple times already throughout this conflict. Watch whether the blockade actually eases, or whether it simply continues grinding forward regardless of whatever framework eventually gets signed in Oman. And watch the tanker traffic numbers themselves, because they'll tell you far more about the real state of this standoff than any official statement from either government is ever likely to. None of those signals require insider access or classified information to track either. Shipping data, satellite imagery, and official statements from named spokespeople on both sides are all publicly available, updated regularly by outlets and organizations whose entire credibility depends on getting the numbers right. That's part of what makes a story like this one so unusually verifiable, even in the middle of an active, ongoing conflict. You don't have to simply trust whichever government's version of events reaches you first. You can watch the same data the analysts are watching, and draw your own conclusions about which side is actually telling the truth about where this standoff genuinely stands. If this video gave you a clearer picture of what's actually happening beneath the surface of this story, that's exactly why this channel exists. Subscribe and stay close, because whatever comes next in the Strait of Hormuz, whether it's a genuine breakthrough or just the next chapter in the same contradiction repeating itself, this is a story still being written in real time, and it deserves to be followed with the full picture rather than reduced to whichever headline moves fastest. Wars and standoffs like this one rarely end with a single clean moment where everyone agrees the story is finally over. More often, they end quietly, buried in a shipping report showing traffic numbers slowly climbing back toward normal, or in a joint statement that finally gets signed by every relevant party rather than just some of them. Until that moment actually arrives, the clearest window into where this genuinely stands isn't going to come from a press conference in Tehran or a briefing in Washington. It's going to come from watching whether the ships start moving again, and whether the voice that controls them finally starts saying the same thing as everyone else, standing behind the same flag.